Howdy there, Jim McCotter here again with Christian Nations Today. Did you know that Jesus was actually a political activist? I mean, I was talking to a Christian friend of mine and said, you know, I don't see where Jesus was involved in politics. We should only be involved in just witnessing to reach the lost and building up Christians. No question, I agree with that. Sharing the gospel with everybody and loving the saints, loving the believers, and building them up. But in Matthew chapter 23 and verse 2, Jesus said, referring to the scribes and Pharisees, he said, they sit in the seat of Moses. And the seat of Moses in Judea at that time was the civil center, the civil authority for the land of Judea, where Moses sat. Moses was the civil leader of Israel. And at that time, the scribes and Pharisees were sitting in the seat of Moses. They were the civic leaders. Pilate was only there representing Rome. So if there was any riots or anything got out of hand, he had his guards that he could send them out, kind of like a military guard. But if there wasn't that, Pilate basically was just a rubber stamp if there was civil law where they thought somebody should be put to death. They did need to get Pilate's approval for that, but it was basically a rubber stamp. In fact, with Jesus, when he was crucified, remember, he said, judge them yourself according to your law. Pilate said that, but they brought him to get the rubber stamp so they could crucify Jesus. But they didn't need to get Pilate's permission to arrest Jesus, to incarcerate him, to hold him. In fact, remember the Sanhedrin, they arrested the apostles in Acts chapter 3, 4, 5, 6, in those chapters, more than once. They arrested the apostles. They put them in jail. They whipped them. So the Sanhedrin was the civil, that was basically like the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the Congress, all in one, was in the Sanhedrin. And Matthew 23:2 says those scribes and Pharisees, they were sitting in the seat of Moses. They were in the position of civil authority, the highest position in Judea. And Jesus was scathing to the Pharisees, those political leaders. The Pharisees were not too dissimilar to the Democrats today, and the scribes, or the Sadducees rather, were not too dissimilar from the Republicans. The Pharisees were the little larger party, the more common blue-collar type party, and the Sadducees were more of like the Republicans, at least the image is, where they were more the business people. And these were the ruling people in Jesus' time. So every time in the Gospels where you see Jesus is contending with the scribes and the Pharisees, especially since they were the primary party, the primary political party, when he was fighting over the law, that was the law of the land. Yes, it was the religious law, but it was also the civil law. Like the Muslims, they have their Sharia law, which is religious law, but it's also their civil law. Well, the Mosaic law was God's civil law, and Jesus was contending with them with this. And he was doing it throughout the Gospels. And nobody was more of a political activist than Jesus himself. And so today, brothers and sisters in Christ, we are at a crossroad with Hillary Clinton and with Donald Trump, and you may think it's not spiritual to be involved, but listen, it's directly going to affect the church. It's directly going to affect your family. It's directly going to affect us getting the gospel out. It's going to directly affect the freedom we have to proclaim Christ and have him as Lord, and really to be, as we say, on our coins, in God we trust, or as we say in our national anthem, in referring to God, one nation under God. If we're really going to be one nation under God, we better get out of our churches and we better campaign, just like Jesus did, against those politicians, just as Jesus did against the Pharisees who were convoluting God's law, as we have had, especially the Democrats that have been convoluting the Constitution and convoluting the law, promoting homosexuality and virtually sodomy and all sorts of godless, immoral things, not to speak of abortion. And this is the political fight. There's only 3 institutions, and I'll close off with this. In the Bible, there's the church institution, there's marriage, and last but not least, and many don't realize it, there's the state. And God is to be head of all 3 of those institutions. In Colossians, it says he's over all authority. He's the head of all authority. In fact, Jesus, in his Great Commission, Matthew 28:18, Jesus said, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. And so we need to have Jesus as king. In the Revolutionary War, they said, no king but Jesus. That was the battle cry, no king but Jesus. And so, dear brothers and sisters in Christ, we've got less than 3 months now to help our nation move back closer to God. I recognize that Donald Trump would not qualify to be an elder or pastor of a church, but we're talking about a civil leader. And compared to Hillary Clinton, there is no comparison. And if you sit back and if I sit back, then we are not engaged in one of God's institutions, the state, and that belongs to him, not Satan. Satan may be prince of power of the air, but Jesus is King of kings. I'll see you tomorrow.